I did not argue with Claire that night. I did not raise my voice or push the little card back across the table. Instead, I passed the cranberry sauce to Daniel and thanked him for carving the turkey, the way I had done every Thanksgiving since he was a boy learning how to hold a knife properly. The dinner continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Plates filled and emptied, forks tapped gently against china, and the grandchildren told stories about school, while Claire described the warm beaches of Hawaii with the enthusiasm of someone who had already imagined the photographs she would post online. Every few minutes, she would add another small detail: the infinity pool overlooking the Pacific Ocean, the sunset dinner cruise, the spa package she had reserved for herself. She spoke as if the trip had been carefully planned for a long time, and perhaps it had been. I noticed the way Daniel nodded along, smiling politely, the same way he had smiled when Claire called the card a joke. My son had always been a quiet man. Even as a child, he preferred listening to speaking, watching instead of interrupting. But there is a difference between quiet and absent, and that evening I felt the space where his voice should have been. At one point Claire said, with a cheerful laugh, that someone would have to keep an eye on the house while they were gone. She said it casually, as though she were mentioning the weather, and then she looked directly at me for a brief moment that lasted just long enough to feel deliberate. I smiled again and took a sip of water. The glass was cool in my hand. Across the table, my oldest grandson was explaining the rules of a board game to his sister, waving a dinner roll like it was a tiny football. The television in the living room erupted with the sound of cheering from the game, and for a moment the whole house felt loud and bright and normal again. But underneath the noise, I kept thinking about that small card resting beside my plate. After dessert, Claire began clearing the table, stacking dishes neatly as she talked about the flight schedule and how early they would need to leave for the airport. I stood up to help, out of habit more than obligation. For decades, Thanksgiving had meant working together in the kitchen after dinner, rinsing plates, wrapping leftovers, laughing about how much food was left over every year. Claire handed me a towel and pointed to the counter where a few serving dishes had already been placed. It was a small gesture, nothing dramatic, but the way she did it reminded me of a restaurant manager assigning tasks at the end of a shift. I dried the dishes quietly and placed them in the cabinet. Daniel passed through the kitchen once or twice, carrying empty glasses, thanking Claire for the meal, but never mentioning the card. No one mentioned it again. By the time I left later that evening, the house was calm, the children were sleepy, and Claire stood at the door wishing me a safe drive home. She hugged me briefly and said she hoped I had enjoyed dinner. I told her that the turkey was excellent, because it had been. Outside, the air was cold in that familiar late November way, sharp and clean with the smell of fallen leaves. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, looking back at the warm lights glowing in Daniel's windows. Families change slowly, the way seasons do. You do not notice the exact day summer turns into autumn, but you do notice the chill when it finally arrives. I drove home slowly that night, the highway nearly empty except for the occasional pair of headlights passing in the opposite direction. Connecticut in late November has a particular kind of quiet after the holidays begin. The trees stand bare, the air carries the smell of cold earth, and every house seems to glow a little brighter from the inside. My own home waited at the end of a small street I had lived on for more than 30 years, a modest two-story place with white siding and a porch my husband built himself one summer long ago. When I turned into the driveway, the porch light flicked on automatically, casting a soft circle of light across the steps. For a moment I sat in the car with the engine still running, listening to the ticking sound it made as it cooled. Houses have memories if you stay in them long enough. Every creaking floorboard reminds you of footsteps that once belonged to someone else. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar smell of old wood, coffee, and the faint trace of cinnamon from the candles I sometimes lit in the evenings. The living room lamp was still on from the morning. I had left it that way out of habit. When you live alone, you begin leaving small lights for yourself, the way people once did for loved ones coming home late. I hung my coat on the rack near the door and walked into the kitchen, placing my purse on the counter. The silence in the house felt gentle rather than lonely. My husband Robert used to say our home had a calm about it, like a lake that never rushed. Robert had been a careful man in many ways. He balanced the checkbook every month, kept folders for every document, and always believed that planning ahead was the quiet form of love a husband could leave behind. When he passed away 5 years earlier, I had spent months slowly learning the routines he once handled without mentioning them. Insurance papers, investment statements, small things that suddenly mattered when there was no one else to remember them. That evening I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table looking out the window into the dark backyard. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked, and then everything settled again. My thoughts drifted back to the dinner conversation about Hawaii, the laughter around the table, and that little card that had been placed so neatly on my plate. Claire had called it a joke. Perhaps it was meant that way. Yet the longer I sat there, the more I remembered other small moments from the past few years, things that had once seemed too minor to question. The weekend Claire asked if I could come over early to watch the children because she and Daniel had a brunch reservation. The afternoon she joked that I was the only person patient enough to clean their kitchen after birthday parties. Even the time she laughed and said that retirement must be nice because it meant I had all the free time in the world. At the time I smiled at each comment and said yes whenever they needed help. That is what mothers do. They say yes so often that eventually no one remembers the effort behind it. I took another sip of tea and glanced toward the hallway where Robert once kept his small home office. The door was still closed the way I had left it earlier that morning. For some reason, I thought about something he had said to me many years before, a quiet remark during a conversation about the future. He had told me not to worry if anything ever happened to him, because everything important had already been taken care of. At the time I had trusted him completely and never asked what he meant. Sitting there in the dim kitchen light, I suddenly wondered what exactly he had arranged. The next morning the house was still quiet when I woke up. Sunlight was just beginning to slip through the kitchen curtains, casting long pale lines across the floor. I moved slowly through the usual routine, filling the kettle, placing 2 slices of bread in the toaster even though I only needed one, a habit that had stayed with me long after Robert was gone. The ticking sound of the kettle heating on the stove reminded me of all the mornings we once shared in this kitchen, reading the newspaper at opposite ends of the table while the coffee brewed. Robert had always believed that mornings were for thinking clearly. He used to say that if something troubled you, the best place to face it was in the quiet of your own home before the rest of the world woke up. That morning I carried my tea down the hallway toward the small room he once used as an office. I had not spent much time there in recent months. The room still held his old wooden desk, the tall metal filing cabinet, and the narrow bookshelf where he kept binders labeled with careful handwriting. Robert had never liked clutter. Everything in that room had a place, and every place had a reason. I opened the door and stepped inside, noticing how the air still carried the faint scent of old paper and cedar from the cabinet drawers. The desk lamp sat exactly where he left it years ago. I turned it on and pulled open the top drawer of the filing cabinet. Inside were rows of folders arranged neatly in alphabetical order. Insurance, property records, bank statements, documents I had already reviewed many times during the long months after his passing. But as I moved the folders aside, something caught my attention near the back of the drawer. It was a thick envelope labeled simply with my name in Robert's handwriting. Seeing those familiar letters made me pause for a moment. My name had always looked steadier when he wrote it, as if the ink itself carried a quiet sense of certainty. I lifted the envelope carefully and sat down in the chair beside the desk. The paper inside felt heavier than I expected. Several pages had been clipped together along with a formal document printed on cream-colored paper. At the top were the words Whitmore Family Trust written in clean black lettering. I read the first page slowly, then again more carefully. Legal language can be dense, but Robert had always believed in clarity. The more I followed the paragraphs, the more I realized that the trust described several assets connected to our family, including investment accounts, a portion of the property Daniel lived in, and certain protections designed to ensure that I would remain financially secure for the rest of my life. I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting the words settle in my mind. Robert had never spoken about this document in detail, yet it was clear that he had arranged it deliberately. At the bottom of the page his signature appeared beside the date from nearly 10 years earlier. For a long time I sat there in the quiet office with the papers resting in my hands. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, and the distant sound of a lawn mower drifted through the open window. I thought again about the conversation at dinner, about Claire's cheerful voice describing the 2-week vacation, about the card she had placed so neatly on my plate. Robert had once told me that careful planning was not about control, but about protection. Looking down at the trust documents, I began to understand that he had not only been protecting our home. In his quiet, thoughtful way, he had also been protecting me. I sat in Robert's office for a long time that morning with the trust documents spread across the desk in front of me. Sunlight slowly moved across the floor, touching the legs of the old wooden chair and the corner of the filing cabinet before climbing gently onto the surface of the desk itself. I read through the pages again, more carefully this time, following the language line by line the way Robert used to do when he reviewed paperwork at the kitchen table. The document explained that the Whitmore Family Trust had been created years earlier to protect certain properties and financial accounts connected to our family. It listed the investments Robert had built gradually during his career and the property Daniel and Claire currently lived in, the large house in Connecticut where we had gathered for Thanksgiving dinner the night before. What surprised me most was the structure Robert had arranged. The trust named me as the primary trustee, meaning I was responsible for overseeing how the assets were managed. Daniel was listed as a beneficiary, but only under certain conditions that allowed the trustee to make final decisions about the use of the property and the distribution of funds. I leaned back slightly in the chair and folded my hands together, letting that realization settle quietly in my mind. For years I had believed that Daniel's home belonged entirely to him and Claire. That was how they spoke about it during family conversations, and it was how I had always pictured it. Yet according to the documents in front of me, the property itself remained under the structure Robert created long ago. The trust was designed so that Daniel could live there and raise his family comfortably, but the legal authorities surrounding the property was more complex than I had ever realized. I turned another page and noticed several notes written in Robert's careful handwriting along the margins. They were small reminders explaining why he had organized things this way. One note simply read, "Margaret should always have security first." Seeing those words made me pause again. Robert had always been thoughtful about the future, but I had not understood just how thorough his planning had been. I gathered the pages together and placed them neatly back into the envelope, then carried the documents to the kitchen table where the morning light felt warmer. Outside, the neighborhood had begun to wake up. A delivery truck rolled slowly down the street, and somewhere nearby someone started a leaf blower, the steady hum drifting faintly through the window. I poured another cup of tea and sat quietly for several minutes, thinking about everything I had learned in the past hour. My thoughts returned briefly to the dinner conversation from the night before, to the laughter around the table and the casual way Claire had spoken about the upcoming trip. At the time I had said very little. I had simply smiled and allowed the evening to pass the way family gatherings often do. But now the pieces of the past few years seemed to arrange themselves differently in my mind. I realized that Robert had not only planned carefully for the future of our family, he had also made sure that if circumstances ever required it, I would have the authority to protect what he built. And sitting there in the quiet kitchen with the envelope resting beside my cup of tea, I began to understand that sometimes the most powerful decisions are the ones made quietly, long before anyone else realizes they matter. I did not call Daniel that day, and I did not mention the documents to Claire. Instead, I placed the envelope back into the drawer in Robert's office exactly where I had found it and closed the cabinet slowly, as if nothing had changed. Some truths require time before they are spoken aloud. That afternoon, I went through the rest of my day the way I usually did. I watered the small plants on the kitchen windowsill, walked to the mailbox at the end of the driveway, and spent an hour reading in the living room chair Robert used to call my command center. Yet my mind kept returning to the trust and the quiet structure Robert had built around our family's future. I realized that he had never been a man who acted out of anger or suspicion. Everything he did was thoughtful, deliberate, and calm. If he created something like that trust, it was not meant as a weapon. It was meant as protection. Late in the afternoon, my phone rang. The screen showed Daniel's name. I answered the call with the same steady voice I always used when speaking to my son. He asked how my drive home had been and whether I had remembered to take the leftover pie Claire packed for me. I told him the drive was peaceful and that the pie was already in my refrigerator. In the background, I could hear the faint sounds of his house, children moving through the hallway, and Claire speaking somewhere nearby. Daniel then mentioned the upcoming trip again, explaining that they would be leaving early Monday morning for the airport and that they would be gone for about 2 weeks. His tone was cheerful, almost distracted, the way people sound when they are already imagining the vacation ahead of them. Then he said something that made me pause for just a moment. He asked if I might be able to stop by the house once or twice while they were away, just to make sure everything stayed in order. The request was phrased politely, but it carried the same quiet assumption that had been sitting on the card at the dinner table. I told him that I would think about it, and that we could talk again before they left. Daniel seemed satisfied with that answer and quickly shifted the conversation to something else, asking about the weather and whether I had plans for the weekend. When the call ended, I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there looking out the window toward the empty street. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the lawns, and somewhere nearby someone was walking a dog along the sidewalk. Everything outside looked calm and ordinary. Yet inside my mind the pieces of Robert's careful planning were beginning to settle into place. I understood now that the situation was not about a single card on a dinner plate or a careless joke during a holiday meal. It was about the quiet balance of respect inside a family, the way small assumptions grow over time until they become expectations. I walked back down the hallway toward Robert's office and paused at the closed door. For years I had believed that the most important thing Robert left behind was the house we built together and the memories inside it. But standing there in the quiet hallway, I began to realize that the most important thing he left behind was something less visible. He left me the ability to decide how the future of our family would unfold. I spent the next few days moving through my routine with the same calm rhythm I always kept. In the mornings I walked down the quiet sidewalk near my house, the cold November air sharp but refreshing, the trees already stripped of their leaves. People passed with dogs on leashes or coffee cups in their hands, each person moving through their own small routines without noticing the thoughts forming quietly in my mind. When I returned home, I made breakfast, checked the mail, and read the newspaper the way Robert and I used to do together years ago. Outwardly nothing had changed. But internally, I was beginning to understand something important about the trust Robert had created. It was not simply a legal document. It was a structure that gave me responsibility. And responsibility, when handled carefully, requires patience. On Saturday morning, I decided to call the law office listed on the trust paperwork. The receptionist recognized Robert's name immediately and transferred me to a man named Thomas Reed, the attorney who had helped organize many of Robert's financial plans over the years. His voice was calm and professional, the voice of someone who had spent decades guiding families through complicated decisions. When I explained who I was, he greeted me warmly and said he had always respected Robert's careful way of thinking. I told him that I had recently reviewed the trust documents again and that I wanted to make sure I fully understood how they worked. Thomas spoke clearly, walking me through the structure in a way that felt less like legal instruction and more like quiet reassurance. He confirmed that the trust had indeed been designed with me as the acting trustee, meaning I had the authority to review the assets and make decisions about how they were managed if circumstances ever required it. He explained that Robert had arranged the trust specifically to ensure that I would never be placed in a vulnerable position financially. When the conversation ended, I thanked him for his time and sat for a while at the kitchen table with the phone still resting in my hand. Outside, the sky had turned pale gray and a light wind pushed leaves along the curb. I thought again about the upcoming trip Daniel and Claire had described so enthusiastically. Their flight would leave early Monday morning, and by that afternoon they would be thousands of miles away enjoying warm ocean air and bright beaches. Later that evening Daniel called again to confirm their travel plans. His voice carried the same relaxed excitement as before. He mentioned the house alarm code, the trash pickup schedule, and the way Claire liked the kitchen counters wiped after the children finished snacks. I listened quietly and told him that I hoped the family would enjoy their vacation. When the call ended, I stood at the window looking out at the quiet street once more. The porch light across the road flickered on as dusk settled over the neighborhood. I realized then that the coming weeks would give me something rare. Time to think clearly, time to understand exactly what Robert had placed in my care, and time to decide how that responsibility should be used. Monday morning arrived cold and quiet. I woke before sunrise, the sky outside still dark with only a faint gray line beginning to appear above the trees. Somewhere across the neighborhood a car door closed and an engine started, and I knew that Daniel and Claire were probably already on their way to the airport. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window while the machine brewed, watching the pale winter light slowly spread across the lawns. There was something calm about that morning, The kind of calm that comes when a decision has already formed even if no one else knows it yet. After breakfast, I drove to the house where Daniel and Claire lived, the same large home where we had gathered for Thanksgiving dinner only days earlier. The driveway was empty now and the windows were dark, the house silent in a way it never was when the children were running through the halls. I used the spare key Daniel kept hidden beneath a small stone near the porch and stepped inside. The air carried the faint scent of the cleaning products Claire liked to use in the kitchen. Everything looked exactly the way it had on Thanksgiving night. The dining table was cleared, the counters spotless, and a small stack of travel brochures still rested near the living room couch, where Claire had been planning their trip. For a moment, I stood quietly in the center of the room, listening to the stillness. Houses change when the people inside them leave. Without voices and footsteps, the walls seemed to hold their breath. I walked slowly through the hallway, noticing the framed family photos on the walls, pictures of Daniel as a child, pictures of the grandchildren smiling at school events and summer picnics. In many ways, it was a beautiful home, full of memories and the life Daniel had built for his family. Yet now I understood something that had been invisible to me before. The house was not simply a place where they lived. It was part of the trust Robert had created years ago, part of a structure designed to keep our family secure. I moved into the kitchen and sat at the table where Claire usually planned her schedules and grocery lists. I placed my purse beside me and removed the envelope containing the trust documents. The quiet room made every small sound clearer, the rustle of paper, the soft creak of the chair beneath me. Robert's careful planning had given me responsibility over these assets, and responsibility means understanding exactly what must be done. Over the next hour, I made several calm phone calls. One was to Thomas Reed at the law office, simply to confirm a few details about the trust structure and the authority connected to it. Another call was to the property management company that handled the trust records. Each conversation was straightforward and professional. No anger, no confrontation, just quiet clarification. By the time I finished the last call, the morning sun had risen fully above the trees, filling the kitchen with soft light. I placed the documents neatly back into the envelope and rested my hands on the table for a moment. The house around me remained silent, the same peaceful silence that often follows the beginning of something new. The following days passed with a quiet rhythm that felt almost peaceful. Each morning I woke early, made coffee, and reviewed the documents Robert had left behind. I spoke once more with Thomas Reed, confirming the final steps required to update certain administrative records connected to the trust. Everything moved slowly and professionally, exactly the way Robert would have preferred. No confrontation was necessary. The trust already contained the structure for every decision that needed to be made. During those 2 weeks, Daniel and Claire were thousands of miles away, enjoying warm beaches and bright sunsets, while winter settled deeper over Connecticut. Occasionally, Daniel sent short messages with photographs of the ocean and the children smiling beside palm trees. I always replied kindly, telling him that the pictures looked beautiful and that I hoped the family was having a wonderful time. Meanwhile, the quiet work continued here at home. The property records connected to the trust were reviewed and updated with the help of the law office. Access to certain financial accounts was reorganized according to the guidelines Robert had established years earlier. Everything remained calm and respectful. By the time the 2 weeks ended, the trust stood exactly as Robert had intended it to be, with its structure clearly documented and its authority firmly in place. When Daniel called to say they would be returning that evening, his voice sounded relaxed and happy. He described the long flight home and how the children had fallen asleep before the plane even left the runway. I told him that I was glad they had enjoyed their trip and that it would be nice to see everyone again soon. The following afternoon, I drove back to the house. The driveway was once again full of life, suitcases stacked near the front door and the children's voices echoing through the hallway as they unpacked souvenirs. Claire greeted me politely, looking sunburned and energetic from the vacation. She spoke enthusiastically about the beaches, the restaurants, and the photographs she planned to share with friends. I listened quietly and congratulated them on what sounded like a lovely trip. Later that evening, we gathered around the dining table again for a simple meal, nothing elaborate, just the comfortable routine of family returning home. At one point, Claire stepped into the kitchen to refill the glasses, leaving Daniel and me alone at the table for a moment. I reached into my purse and placed a small envelope beside his plate. Daniel looked at it with mild curiosity and asked what it was. I explained calmly that it contained copies of the trust documents Robert had prepared years ago and that it might be helpful for him to understand how the property and family assets were organized. Daniel opened the envelope and began reading quietly. The room remained peaceful, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound between us. When he finished the first page, he looked up with a thoughtful expression I had not seen in a long time. I simply folded my hands on the table and met his eyes. Sometimes the strongest message does not require anger or raised voices. Sometimes it only requires clarity, patience, and the quiet reminder that respect inside a family is never something to be taken for granted.